Hello everybody, welcome to another video in the Students Exemplar series. Today looking at an analysis of Mrs. Birling. How does Priestley use the character of Mrs. Birling to explore ideas about social class? So let's jump right in. Priestley uses Mrs. Birling to demonstrate the upper class who champion capitalist views to be selfish and patronising to others through the way Priestley uses her speech style and the structure of the play in order to steer the audience away from capitalism. Okay, so as you know through looking at my videos, we have to be careful when we're analysing a character that we don't write about the character as if they're real, but we realise they are a construct from the writer who uses those characters to present their ideas and themes. And this introduction explains very clearly, look, Mrs. Birling is used to criticise capitalist views, and not only that, and I think this is a really nice touch, but I'm going to explore how speech style and structure is used to present that theme and idea. So that's a good introduction, and certainly one that suggests this is going to go very well. Priestley uses structure and form to present Mrs. Birling as an immediately elitist person from her house having a large dining room of a suburban house. This is purposely done to imply her to be a very affluent woman who will thus be patronising to others in a lower social class due to her elitism. Also, it suggests that material goods are a very significant part of her life and suggests she may favour her prosperity, therefore her wealth to be more important than the lives of others. This therefore is why Priestley's placed this description to immediately provoke the audience to couple the following actions of Mrs. Birling to the capitalist views by Priestley to convey his didactic message that capitalism cannot continue, especially as the play is written, and it is possible that Priestley has captured the feeling of the time in his didactic play. So I like this opening idea, which is sort of two things. It's suggesting the stage directions present something about Mrs. Birling, which of course they do, but also the significance of this being the opening of the play. So this is our initial impression, and therefore, the sort of the things that follow are used to undermine our initial impression. Also, Priestley tailors Mrs. Birling's speech to portray her as a rather strict and dominating through her reprimands and instructions throughout Act 1. Mrs. Birling shockingly even reprimands her husband when he tries to send his compliments to the cook. She tells him, Arthur, you ought not to say such things. This reprimand suggests that she's invested in the decorum of a dinner party when she's mostly surrounded by her family, except for Gerald. And this suggests she's very conscious of the impression she and her family send out to others. That's a good point. I've never thought about that, actually, that, when you've just got your family and one other there, do you really need to follow those rules and regulations? Furthermore, Priestley juxtaposes Mrs. Birling to her children, significantly the daughter Sheila, who is much more emotional about her encounter with the marginalised Eva Smith. Sheila insists they're people too in response to her father's awful views of his workers. This exclamation suggests that Sheila is unlike her parents, as they see them as disposable workers. Also, it shows how emotional she is, and there seems to be a lack of control by talking back to her father who's meant to be respectful in the family. This deliberate tension put in place by Priestley may be a subtle way of demonstrating the beauty of socialism through this outburst of independence and the confidence to argue against the positive aspects of socialism. Argue against her father. Also, Mrs. Birling is used to demonstrate the positive aspects of socialism when she reprimands her husband, again showing how social class system is flawed, as Mrs. Birling feels above everyone in her family. Now, just at this point, you have to be careful that you don't get carried away writing about the plot as if we learn things about the characters, but bring each point back to the writer. So this paragraph here about the speech style and thinking that, being overly conscious about what the significance of a dinner party, it would be good to then go on to say, and what does that mean, in terms of the wider themes and ideas about capitalism or whatever, and what is Priestley saying through this? Because this paragraph is just about the play as if the characters are real. It's a good point, but of course the question is, how does Mrs. Birling explore ideas about social class? And this didn't quite go into that. But then we got into this next section, which is more about Priestley, the deliberate tension he wants to put there, the subtle way of demonstrating the beauty of socialism. So that's better. Now, where did we get to? So when Birling is used to demonstrate Mrs. Birling is used to demonstrate the positive aspects of socialism when she reprimands her husband, again showing how the social class system is flawed, as Mrs. Birling feels above everyone in her family. Also, the statement made by Sheila shows that the younger generation are much more open-minded and influential than Mrs. Birling, displaying the possibility that the country will not always be in control of people who demand the status quo, and that there is hope for the future, removing social class created through Priestley's proselytizing. Good. Again, this lovely bit at the end is very important. Now, if you're asked to write about Mrs. Birling, as we've seen here, it's absolutely fine to bring in some points about, for example, Sheila, if those points are used to exemplify what you're trying to say about Mrs. Birling. So, and that's exactly what we see here, this kind of look. Mrs. Birling is presented as this. She is contrasted, she's juxtaposed with the presentation of Sheila, and the combined effect is this. The structural stability of Mrs. Birling, built by Priestley, totally pushes the reader to totally reject the upper class and overall the discrimination that social class causes. So that's a nice topic sentence. I'm looking forward to hearing what is meant by the structural stability of Mrs. Birling, built by Priestley, and let's have a look. Mrs. Birling explains where she stands and says, "I'm sorry she should have come to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame for it all." The short syntax implies her coldness and disregard for others below her. Okay, so we're analysing sentence structures, that's good. The effect caused by the contrasting impacts of the two statements shows there is the possibility for Mrs. Birling to feel remorse, but also it implies how she feels there ought to be a distance between the classes, which again demonstrates the elitist views that are innate in Mrs. Birling. The fact that Mr. Birling rather favours his character, but Priestley deliberately does this to alienate Mrs. Birling, especially at the time of the play was written, the society was still based on a patriarchal homogeny, and this reprimand of her husband may be done to further alienate her from the audience, as Priestley uses the misogyny of the time to provoke contempt for the capitalist nasty views of her that she shares with the upper class, suggesting sympathy towards the lower class. Okay, so it's kind of, we hate Mrs. Birling and with it everything she stands for, which is pretty much, what the entire text is about, I think. The sort of what these characters stand for is made very clear early on, so that when we grow to dislike them, we, as an extension of that, grow to dislike what they stand for. Priestley purposefully gives Mrs. Birling a significant role in society, being chair of a charity. However, he's only done that in order to underpin the flaws of the upper class attitudes. Mrs. Birling explains to the inspector that she gave herself ridiculous airs, calling herself Mrs. Birling, and the adjective ridiculous creates an accusatory, contemptuous tone from Mrs. Birling about a poor girl that the audience are being made to sympathise with. Also, it implies that a girl from a lower class could never have such a name, revealing the views of the upper class towards those below them. Mrs. Birling, therefore, seems to be only working with the charity for the reputation of her own image, not the moral reason of wanting to help others. Furthermore, the fact that she sees it to be ridiculous when it's revealed to be true creates a sense of dramatic irony and undermines Mrs. Birling's judgment and reinforces the argument that she's only taken this responsible role for her own self-interest. Priestley has her override this with the following statement, suggesting the human condition is within her, but she chooses to be programmed to self-interest. Also, the insincere statement, "I'm sorry," shows how she finds the death of others below her as insignificant. Priestley has displayed the human condition here with contrast of statement. However, Mrs. Birling has been corrupted by capitalist views, pushing her to disregard others of a lower social class. So that's quite an interesting idea that is explored in a lot of detail here, which is that the sort of structure of the two sentences together is significant. So I think that's a good idea, and an idea that is not something a lot of people would have. Overall, Priestley's used Mrs. Birling to highlight the incorrect path regarding how to live your life, as he presents her to feel above and disregard others, coupled with the juxtaposition to her daughter, whom Priestley's proselytizing works upon demonstrates how Mrs. Birling's attitudes towards social class is despicable and the audience should accept socialist views. Okay, so it's a pretty strong answer. Occasionally a little bit waffly. I think, the issue when we've got a real piece, this was a real mock, completed in real mock conditions, is that, not always are the ideas explained totally clearly. But overall, it's a solid answer, and I hope you found the video useful.